Welcome, everybody, to the Higher Ed Finance and Policy Committee. I'd like to call this meeting to order. So to start this meeting, I'd like for the members of the committee and some of our staff to introduce themselves before we get into some of the overviews. And I'm very happy to see our nonpartisan, fantastic staff here to do some overviews. Thank you so much for coming. So let's start. We'll start right here to my left with my CLA.
My name is James Cook, Committee Legislative Assistant for Chair Rarick.
Lori Cousino, Committee Administrator for Chair Rarick and the committee.
Erica Schwartz. I'm Vice Chair.
Representative Keith Allen, 19A, which is south of the Twin Cities, encompasses the communities of Faribault, Kenyon-Winnemingo, Janesville, and those areas. So,
Representative Peggy Scott, I represent 31B, which is northern Anoka County.
Representative Paul Novati, I represent 30B, which is Elk River, parts of Otsego, all of Nowthen, and parts of Oak Grove.
Representative Matt Bliss, representing District 2B.
Thank you, members. So with that, we do have quorum. And I will note for the record that the Democrat members of the committee are not here. And so we will see when they will come, but they are not here today. Also, I want to note that we've invited the Office of Higher Education to come for 4 days to present a deep dive on their budget and all the money that comes through their budget. And as much as they would probably like to be here, they are under orders from the governor to not show until what they said was that the legislature is legitimate and there is bipartisanship. So they will not be here today or on Tuesday or Thursday next week or the following week. So instead, and not instead because you guys are fantastic, but we have our nonpartisan fiscal and policy staff that are here that will do a walkthrough. And as you all know, I'm a fairly thorough person as a chair and as a member, and so they will be doing a fairly deep dive because my hope is that since this is the third largest budget in our state budget, that we will really take note of everything that we're spending money on and take it very, very seriously. So this is the first day of taking this budget incredibly seriously. I'm just very sad that OHE is not here to present for themselves, and hopefully they will be given the ability and green light to come in a future hearing. But with that, we'll turn it over to our nonpartisan fiscal, Mr. Savory, if you would introduce yourself for the committee and then start your presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. My name is Ken Savory. I'm the nonpartisan fiscal analyst, and I cover higher education as well as the agriculture committee. And with that, Madam Chair, I will go through a set of slides that should be in members' packets. As you can see, they're on the screens to your left and right. And the title is Higher Education Finance Overview. So we will begin. Just to start, I wanted to familiarize members with just the budget periods in which this committee will be making decisions for over the next handful of months. In general, the state fiscal year runs from July 1st to June 30th. Currently, the state budget is in the 24 and 25 biennium. Fiscal year 24 has been completed, and fiscal year 25 will end on June 30th of this year. So this summer, June 30th will be the last day of FY 25. And the first day of the next biennium, which is FY 26-27, will begin on July 1st, 2025. So decisions that are made in this budget bill will be for the FY 26-27 biennium, and the tails, which we'll talk about in a moment, are for FY 28 and 29. So those are the four kind of periods of time in which the committee will be making decisions and recommendations on. Moving on, I just wanted to cover a few kind of general budget terms. Just in terms of lay of the land, the higher education bill is 99% general fund appropriations. There's a small healthcare access fund appropriation that does go to the University of Minnesota, but the majority of those are what's called a direct appropriation. And a direct appropriation is essentially an appropriation to an agency for a specific purpose for a specific amount of time. And that specific amount of time is usually within the biennium. So the vast majority of appropriations that will be made in, say, the next higher ed omnibus finance bill will be for the FY 26 and 27 biennium. and any dollars that are unexpended unless directed by law would then fall back to the bottom line or to the state treasury. And all of those appropriations that are in the omnibus bill are in session law. The higher education bill has no statutory appropriations or open statutory appropriations in its current makeup. That doesn't mean that the committee can make choices to do that, but traditionally they have been in the session law funding sphere. As I kind of mentioned before, direct appropriations made in session law. Going down on the page, you'll see some notes about statutory appropriations. The biggest difference between statutory appropriations and direct appropriations is that the direct appropriations occur in session law. The statutory appropriations occur in statute, meaning that they occur in perpetuity or until specified by statute when they would start or end, and that the committee would have to make active decisions to change those. They don't necessarily come up every 2 years for decision making. Moving forward, this is just another note about open appropriations. Again, this is not an appropriation type in which traditionally the higher ed committee has had these, but an open appropriation is a type of statutory appropriation where the funds are allocated on an automatic basis. Typically, they have formulas or funding formulas that decree how the law distributes money to various entities. A good example of this is the K-12 funding formula or an open appropriation, say for health and safety, something like natural disaster firefighting, kind of things of that nature. So they occur as purposes kind of designate. Some common terms that the committee will discuss over the next several months will have to do with the base budget, or the base for an appropriation, and the tails for an appropriation. The style in which budgeting is done at the legislature is a base plus or minus status, in which there is a base for an appropriation determined by a previous bill, and then this committee and like committees of the House and Senate decide whether to keep that appropriation the same, increase it, decrease it, or some kind of combination of the several I just mentioned. So for example, the base for programs in FY26 are determined by previous appropriations in FY25, or if the law is different, we'll see that example in a moment. It designates what those are. So typically it's the previous year's funding will roll into the next biennium, and then this legislature will make a decision as to the status of that appropriation numerically, or if it will continue forward at all. As I mentioned before, the tails biennium in which the committee will be dealing with is FY's fiscal years 28 and 29. The tails in this sense are determined by what the committee will establish as the base for FY26 and 27, unless there are designations within session law that change those. So for example, if the funding in FY27 is $200,000 for a particular appropriation, unless the appropriation is listed as one time or is slightly different in the tails, that will move forward as $200,000 into the next biennium, unless this committee decides otherwise. Moving forward, just to kind of bring this point home about base appropriations is an example from the higher education bill from the previous iteration of it. As you can see, each year has a column. So in this case, FY24 was the first column of $200,000 and FY25 was the second column. And so as you can see, the ongoing base in this example, because the rider language is unspecified for what the tails would be, is $200,000 as that move forward. So it's establishing a base of $200,000, and that would move forward kind of into the tails. This is an example of a base appropriation with a tails modifier or a tails designation. You'll see in clause B there, this is dealing with the state grant program from a previous bill, that clause B essentially designates what the base for the appropriation will be in a future year. And so to bring it forward to kind of this year, if you wanted to do a tails modifier, you would essentially be establishing what FY28 would be moving forward into subsequent years. And then those tails will be tracked on the spreadsheet just like any other appropriation within the committee's jurisdiction. There's also a designation called a one-time appropriation. And that is an appropriation that occurs only within the biennium in which you're budgeting. So for example, would be FY 26 and 27. So it only occur within that period or just one of those fiscal years. I copied some language from subdivision 24 of a previous finance bill that talks about the Next Generation Nursing Initiative. The program in this example isn't necessarily important, but you look at the first column, it will show $3 million only in the first year. So when you see an appropriation only in the first year, and it doesn't matter which year it is, if it's in this case, FY 24 or FY 26 this year, that appropriation is to be assumed to be zero in the subsequent year. So you'll see a zero in that column to your right-hand side, and there's really no need in this example to have language designating that the base is zero or that it's one time, because it's the way it's written, the assumptions with the reviser's code is that it is assumed to have zero in the next year. However, you'll see a copy and paste from subdivision 48, which is a foster care grant program. And if you look at the absolute last line on the bottom, it says language to the effect of this is the one-time appropriation. So meaning that in this example, $500,000 is paid or is appropriated in the first year, $500,000 is appropriated in the second year, but there is no tails moving forward into subsequent tails biennium based on the language that says it's one time. Moving forward I just wanted to lay out a calendar for the committee's kind of decision-making process, both for this committee and the legislature more generally. So from a budget enactment timeline perspective, the first one has already happened. The November forecast has already been released. In January, obviously, the legislature has convened. And then the governor makes budget recommendations by a date specified in law. And that governor can certainly do it before that, but it has to do it by that date that's specified in law. At the end of February, you'll have the February economic forecast, and that will be the last forecast that this legislature will receive before making budget decisions. The key thing about the February forecast is that in the House, it starts a clock to enact a budget resolution. House rule states that once the February forecast has been released, Ways and Means Committee has 25 days to enact a budget resolution. And within that budget resolution will be targets in terms of additional to regular base funding, a zero target, so at the current level of funding, or a cut target, which is below the current level of funding for the base. In April, omnibus bills like these will potentially leave this committee and then go to Ways and Means and then move to the floor. Conference committees will begin approximately that time, or typically have in the past. In the month of May, conference committees generally conclude. Those conference reports then move back to the House of Origin, sometimes the House, sometimes the Senate, depending on if it's used a Senate file or a House file. And then those conference reports will be voted up or down by the various bodies, and then the positively affirmed ones will move to the governor for a veto or a signing into law. The next slide is just kind of a general list of the higher education finance accounts. This is the typical makeup of what the higher education committee has been in the past. It typically contains the Office of Higher Education, Minnesota State Colleges and Universities, Min-State, the University of Minnesota, and then the Mayo Foundation and its residency programs. The next several charts, or the next several pie charts, reference spending, historical spending from a general fund perspective in terms of pieces of a general fund budget pie. This one is from 1988, 1989. Kind of the key piece here is I wanted to demonstrate to members that higher education, or post-secondary ed, as it's called in the upper kind of 1 o'clock portion of the pie, is a significant part of the state budget. In this year, it was 13.4%. And then kind of moving forward into another time period in FY 26 and 27 for general fund spending, you can see that the budget is changed to $31.5 billion versus the previous budget, and the higher education is an 8.8% portion of that budget. Moving a little bit past that to current day, for FY 24-25, you'll see the pieces of the pie are generally much different than they were 25 and 30 years ago. So this is the pie as kind of we see it now. You'll see this is data from the November forecast, the most recent forecast for FY '24 and '25. So these are expenditures. And you'll see higher education up kind of in the left-hand 11 o'clock side of the pie, that it's 5.9%. Kind of the point here is to illustrate that although higher education has had generally positive economic targets or positive budget targets in the last many funding years, the percentage is going to change based on the piece of the pie. As other pies grow, shrink, stay the same, various other pieces can grow, shrink, and stay the same, despite the fact that they either go up or down. But in higher ed's case, it has gone in the positive. And there's a slide down the road where we can talk about kind of the general history of budget targets, but this piece kind of informs that general idea. Some of these terms we've kind of already mentioned. We talked about the general fund a moment ago. For operations and maintenance, this is the main funding mechanism for state higher education, public higher education systems in the state. Both Minnesota State and the U of M receive what's called an operations and maintenance appropriation. It's essentially an appropriation, a large lump sum containing riders and specificity that allows the institutions to operate from a financial standpoint. Moving down one, state special appropriations, there's a few slides at the end of this presentation about those. We'll go into some more detail there. A state special appropriation is an appropriation. They always typically go to the University of Minnesota. They're for a specific designation kind of outside an O&M. So if members are familiar with the agriculture state special, this is kind of something that would fall in this general bucket. There's a kind of a term or a marker referring to statute in the Higher Education Committee, essentially that kind of designates the tuition split between revenues in which an institution would receive from a tuition perspective, and then revenue in which they would receive from a general fund funding perspective. And there's a slide that's coming up right after this, so we can kind of talk about that. But generally, it's kind of the system's perspective of how much revenue they receive in general fund dollars versus how much revenue they generate in tuition revenue, and that ratio. So if it's 50-50, they mean 50% of their revenue comes from general fund appropriations, and then 50% from tuition. And then we've talked about the out year biennium or the tail, so we'll skip that one for now. Minnesota Statute 135A.01 lays out a policy of the legislature to fund public institutions at a 2/3, 1/3 ratio, meaning 2/3 would come from general fund appropriations and 1/3 would come from the individual system revenue for tuition. And then the next slides kind of have some data on how that policy compares to how things are happening over the last several years. And so breaking it down kind of by institution type or institutions generally, this is data from the University of Minnesota that shows in 2000, for example, if you look on the right-hand side, the amount receiving in general fund appropriations was approximately 70%, and then tuition revenue was 29% of their revenue. Fast forwarding to kind of to current year 2025, 2024, those numbers are quite a bit different, where appropriations represent 42 and 43% respectively for appropriations received through the omnibus bill, and then 58 and 57% respectively are received through tuition revenue. And as you can see in the early 2010s, those numbers have kind of waffled, changed as the legislature has made choices on how to allocate funding for the U of M and Min State. Switching to the other higher ed grouping within the committee's jurisdiction, Minnesota State, you can see on all the way at the end of the chart for the year 2000, where the funding was essentially aligned with statute 135A.01, approximately 67% and then 32%. And then kind of going to present day where it's 55% for the appropriation total and then 44.8% for the tuition total. You can see in 2013, Min State was in a roughly a different place where it was reversed, where approximately 60% was from tuition and about 40% was from appropriation. And kind of over the years, in the last, say, 10 to 12 years, that number has gradually kind of equaled out and then gradually sort of tilted in the way of appropriations over the last several years. The next slide is a bar chart that tracks higher education general fund appropriations from 2006 to 2027. The last two lines on the chart are FY 26 and 27. These are the base amounts that are listed in the November forecast and listed in the November general fund balance. So if this committee instructed Mr. Hopkins and I to create a bill that was just base funding kind of moving forward into the next year, those were the numbers we would use to kind of guide our drafting of that finance article. As you can see, based on kind of the concept of one-time versus permanent or base funding, the lines kind of oscillate up and down between various two-year periods. So you'll see in FY 24 and 25, those lines and numbers are above the ones in 26 and 27. So by that, you can kind of see that there was a decent amount of one-time funding in the previous budget that now is not represented in this budget. So the spending is lower than it was in 24 and 25. And by spending, I mean projected spending if the base were just simply carried forward into the next 2 years, next 2 fiscal years.
Thank you, Mr. Saver. I'm just going to have you pause for just a second, and Representative Robbins, you have a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here. I just wanted to, before we leave this slide, so it looks like there was, as you pointed out, the significant one-time money in 24, 25. So if we went back to 22, 23 as a base, what would be the percentage difference between what was 22, 23 and what's projected for 26, 27? We took those two.
Chair and members, I don't have that information on me right now, but we can certainly go back and run that math and figure that out.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Savory. So thank you, Representative Robbins. I would say that the increase from the base, if we looked at what we budgeted last time, was $650 million over base in the year we're in now. And so what we're budgeting for now in the tail, what was the tails, which is now our budget base, was $450 million over the base. So if you do the numbers, that's kind of where it landed, was 650 over base, and then in the tails was 450 over base. All right, thank you, Mr. Savory. Continue, please.
And Madam Chair, and it just reminds me that this chart may help answer that question in terms of going from the previous 22-23 budget percentage-wise to 24-25. We can certainly still get that data on 26 and 27, but from a percentage perspective, this chart kind of lays out the fiscal overview of the 2023 session, which was budgeting for FY 24 and 25. So you'll see on the bottom in bold, in the enacted FY 24-25 column, the enacted budget was approximately $4.15 billion, which comparing to 22-23 base was a 17.5% increase above the base. And then you'll see the enacted projection in FY 26-27 of the columns we talked about before that were in the forecast. Kind of looking back at the at the 2023 bill for FY 24 and 25, typically decision-making around various higher education budgets are kind of seen as a three-legged stool, in which there are appropriations for the U of M, appropriations for Min-State, and then appropriations for the Office of Higher Education. Those are kind of the big three decision buckets that often come before this committee. And so this pie chart, just as a piece of information for the committee to kind of take with them, is how percentage-wise the actual enacted budget is broken out. So you'll see that Mayo represents a relatively small, less than 1% part of the budget that was enacted in 24 and 25. You'll see the Office of Higher Ed approximately 19%, Minnesota State about 45%, and then the U of M 36%. The next slide is about the 2024 Omnibus Higher Education Finance Bill. Sometimes there is an omnibus supplemental budget, and sometimes there is not. This happens to be one of the years, 2024, where that did occur. So there were some changes made to the previous budget. Just to kind of go over briefly as a review for members, the North Star Promise program was reduced by $5 million, approximately $5 million in FY25, and that money was reallocated to the Fostering Independence Grant Program. And then there was a small appropriation for $500,000 for the Minnesota State Kids on Campus program, and that was the subsequent committee target. You'll see on the bottom, there's a percentage line that kind of lays out the percentage increase over the February forecast base, and they were both, in both years, less than 1%. I'll be pretty brief on this slide just because it's pretty technical, but I just wanted members to have kind of a reference point when they are looking at either past omnibus higher education finance bills or when this committee is doing its work on its own omnibus higher education finance bill. Kind of list the order in which the finance article is structured. There'll be, the Office of Higher Education traditionally is the first agency listed. There'll be information about the state grant, other various financial aid programs, and then kind of other riders as necessary for the agency's budget to be constructed. Minnesota State is somewhat the same, in which there'll be an appropriation for the central office and shared services, the O&M appropriation or operations and maintenance. There'll be some designated spending riders within the operation and maintenance appropriation. And then there'll be other riders kind of at the end outside of O&M that designate what the what Min State can do with other dollars. The U of M is laid out very similarly, with the exception of at the end end of that section there'll be state special appropriations that will, as we'll go through in a minute, designate various purposes that are outside of O&M. And then the Mayo Foundation has two riders related to its medical school and the residency programs for which it operates. The next several slides are just kind of small kind of snapshots of what the base budget is for 26 and 27 and the expected tails or estimated tails in FY 28 and 29 based on the November forecast. Because the Higher Education Committee contains no forecasted programs, these numbers will likely remain exactly the same when the February forecast comes out, because they are simply direct appropriations that the bill has instructed what the base is, and there will potentially be no change between the November forecast and February forecast for this budget area. So for the Office of Higher Ed, for FY 26 and 27, the overall total base appropriation that the committee will start from will be approximately $725 million. The state grant takes up $450 million within that 725. The North Star Promise takes up $99 million of the overall piece, and then other programs are approximately $176 million.
Mr. Saver, can I ask you a quick question as we pause here? So you have North Star Promise. Do you also, is in the other programs, is that where North Star Promise Plus is, or have you put both of those programs in North Star Promise in this line?
Chair and members, from a technical perspective, the transfer of North Star Promise dollars into the special revenue account encompasses all of the appropriations for North Star Promise. So everything that in that account is for the North Star Promise's purpose.
Very good. Thank you so much. And so, and I'm not sure if Mr. Hopkins has this more of an explanation of North Star Promise and North Star Promise Plus, but can you just briefly explain what North Star Promise Plus is? It's a little different than North Star Promise. Mr. Hopkins.
Madam Chair and members, so when the North Star Promise program was created in the 2023 Omnibus Bill, you saw on Mr. Savory's slide that there was a large jump in one-time spending in those years for that biennium. North Star Promise is part of that. There was one-time money that was put in a special revenue fund to create supplemental grants, which are being referred to as North Star Promise Plus grants. And They can be up to 50% of a student's Pell Grant award, and this is on top of the amount that a student would get under the North Star Promise program. That's a temporary part of North Star Promise. This plus part is temporary. It's only for the first 3 academic years that the program's in operation, and it's funded by that one-time money that's in the Special Revenue Fund. So the ongoing base appropriation for the North Star Promise program that's reflected in this number here is not intended to be for that North Star Plus grant money. It's for the core part of the North Star Promise program, if that answers the question.
Thank you, Mr. Hopkins. And can you just explain what a student could use North Star, we'll just call it the Plus program, the North Star Promise Plus, what they can use it for as opposed to just the tuition reimbursement, which is last in with North Star Promise?
Sure, Madam Chair and members. So the North Star Promise program scholarship is a last dollar scholarship that covers up to the entire tuition and mandatory fees charged by an institution. So the North Star Plus money then is over and above that, so it could be used for anything that any expenses that a student has over and above the tuition and fees they're charged. So there would be like housing, meals, books and supplies and things like that it could go towards.
Thank you, Mr. Hopkins. Any other questions at this juncture, since I did interrupt them? Representative Robbins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just if you could clarify on that, are there any restrictions on what they use the North Star Promise Plus money for? Or they just get the money and they can choose, they don't have to like submit receipts or utility bills or rent bills or anything, they just get the money and they can use it for anything?
Mr. Hopkins.
Yes, that's right. I mean, for tax purposes, in order for it not to be taxed, it needs to be used for costs related to your education, including books, supplies, room and board, and things like that. But if it's just reimbursed to the student because it's over and above the amount that their institution is charging them, then the student gets the money.
Any other questions at this juncture? Okay, I have one quick one too, Mr. Hopkins. So as we talked about this before we got ready for this committee hearing, we talked about North Star Promise Plus and that there were no requirements to actually work in the state of Minnesota. So you could use the money and then move to Florida or Texas or Arizona. You can move anywhere. And so can you just talk briefly about that? And are there any programs that we have that are grants for education that have those kind of requirements? Thank you, Mr. Hopkins.
Yeah, Madam Chair and members, there are a few programs. I think they're mainly limited to the loan repayment assistance programs that the Office of Higher Education administers that do have work requirements that say you need to be working in Minnesota in order to receive this, and you need to, and if you receive it before if you receive the money before you've completed your academic program, they may include requirements. And because there are some also scholarships that are geared towards specific kinds of jobs, like teachers or something like that, where you would have to make a commitment to work in Minnesota after you've completed your academic program. So there are programs that have those kinds of in-state residency or in-state work requirements attached to them. But you're correct, the North Star Promise program does not have any requirement like that for after graduation.
Great. Okay, thank you, Mr. Hopkins. Representative Robbins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just processing your answer on my previous question. For tax purposes, you said they have to use it for education-related expenses or housing or books or whatever. So is the income from the North Star Promise Plus taxable?
Mr. Hopkins.
Madam Chair, Representative Robbins, I'm getting out of my depth a little bit here because I'm not really that familiar with the tax rules around it. But my understanding is that in order for a scholarship award to be not taxed as a scholarship award, it needs to go to educational expenses. But I don't know how that's enforced and what the sort of reporting requirements are around that.
Any other questions from members? Okay, we'll continue. I believe Mr. Savory was in the middle of a presentation, and thank you for allowing us to interrupt you because we have thoughts as they come up. Thank you. Mr. Savory.
Chair and members will turn now to a similar chart for Minnesota State. Just wanted to point out here that the O&M appropriation of $1.6 billion $6.7 billion is their primary funding mechanism. The administrative central office does receive its own appropriation that isn't part of the O&M, and that's just shy of $73 million. And then moving to the U of M, wanted to point out that their two largest appropriation types is the O&M appropriation at approximately $1.2 billion, and that the state specials comprise approximately $139 million between 5 various state specials that are combined into one for this purpose, as shown here.
And really quickly again, so members, we will go deep when the University of Minnesota comes to do their presentation, and we'll talk about the specials that we just highlighted here. So that is $139 million of specials. So we'll hear back from different specials and what they're doing and what they do with that money. Thank you, Mr. Savory. You can continue.
And Chair and members, just wrapping up kind of the last piece of the higher education budget area, the Mayo Clinic or Mayo Foundation. As you can tell, kind of just by numbers generally, they are a much smaller component of the higher education budget, and they have two primary riders, two primary programs which the state appropriates to. One is the Mayo Medical School, and then the other is the Mayo Family and Residency Program. Moving on to a history of spending targets. So as I referred to earlier, within a budget resolution or resolution between the legislature regarding budget spending targets, as you can see, the odd numbered years are reference years that we refer to as budget years at the legislature, in which the next 2 years of fiscal years should be funded unless they're to prevent a government shutdown. And then the even numbered years are supplemental budgets, which then either increase or decrease the previously enacted budget. If you see a dash on one of those lines, that just represents there was no target or was no target and it was zero. So you'll see in 2012 and in 2020, both being supplemental years, there was no higher education supplemental bill or no higher education target for the general fund. But I'll point out that FY23, the chair referenced the previous target for legislative year 2023 for the 24-25 budget was $650 million. Oftentimes, there will be references to what things called tails targets. Tails targets typically aren't listed in budget resolutions, but they are considerations that the Committee on Ways and Means will make when putting together the various budget year targets.
Thank you, Mr. Savory. I have another question. Representative Allen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I was just kind of wondering, you see the jump from 650 million going up to 500. I'm just wondering, is that, just for my own clarity, is that 650 million, it stays in place and it's just going to jump, they're going to tack on another 500 on top of that for going into 2024?
Mr. Savory.
Madam Chair and members, the numbers that are represented in the odd numbered years are the upper limit in which the House Committee on Ways and Means set for higher education spending. So anything above that will be a violation of the House rules and could not occur without a vote of the body to supersede the budget resolution.
Representative Allen.
I'm good, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions while we did a pause here? Okay. Thank you. Continue, Mr. Savory.
Madam Chair, there's about 3 or 4 slides left, and they are about state special appropriations. I won't read these all to you, but I'll point out a few things kind of as we go along. The largest state special appropriation is for agriculture, called the Agricultural State Special. It's been around since approximately the mid-1970s, so this entity, this part of the law is quite old. But as you'll see, there's various kind of research that is done that is listed on the first bullet point. It mostly deals with the College of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resources, research around food systems, horticulture, et cetera. The rider language is quite long. It's about 2 to 3 pages. So the amount and specificity in terms of the types of research that are listed there is pretty lengthy. And I wanted to point out too that there's a report that typically goes back to the House Committee on Agriculture and Higher Education, and that next report is due on February 1st of this year. But if you're looking for previous reports, those are available at the Legislative Reference Library, or Mr. Hopkins and I can help you find one if you're looking for one. The second special that I just wanted to review here is the Health Sciences Special, about approximately $18.4 million. It includes $346,000 for to support 12 residency physicians at St. Cloud Hospital. And then the remainder of the dollars are for health science and veterinary initiatives as described within the rider language. The next ones are for the College of Science and Engineering. This is a smaller one of $2.2 million. Used for the Geological Survey and the Talented Youth Mathematics Program. The System Special is approximately $14.3 million. This contains funding for NRRI up near the UMD, the Duluth campus. It's $2 million per year to invest in applied research, and the remainder of it goes to other items at NRRI, Cura, which is at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, I believe, the Bell Museum of Natural History, and then the Humphrey exhibit. And then lastly, wrapping up the state specials, there is one between the University of Minnesota and the Mayo Foundation partnership. The base is approximately $15.9 million. And 7.4 of that is for research partnerships between the two entities. And then $500,000 of that 15 million biennially is carved out for conducting Alzheimer's related research. And Chair and members, that wraps up kind of a broad general fiscal overview. It certainly takes questions now, or certainly can entertain them after Mr. Hopkins does his slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Savory. Any other questions at this point? Seeing none, we'll move on to Mr. Hopkins.
Madam Chair and members, my name is Nathan Hopkins. I'm the nonpartisan legislative analyst from the House Research Department, and I staff this committee. So I'll help you draft any bills that you would like to introduce regarding higher education, amendments for committee or on the floor, or answer any questions that you have related to higher education issues in conjunction with Mr. Savory, especially if they're about money and fiscal stuff, or independently if they're just about policy issues. Feel free to email both of us if you have a question and you're not sure who it should go to. I'm going to talk a little bit about this committee's traditional jurisdiction. And one way of thinking about that question is, what does this committee do? It's a helpful question if you're new to the committee. And another way of framing the question is, what does the state of Minnesota do regarding higher education? Because this committee deals with everything the state of Minnesota does regarding higher education. There are three main pieces regarding the state's role in higher education that I'm going to talk about. The first is the Office of Higher Education. The second two are the two public post-secondary systems in the state of Minnesota, the University of Minnesota system and the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities, or MnState, formerly MnSCU. So the Office of Higher Education, this slide lists quickly some of their main functions. They administer financial aid programs, including the self-loan and self-refinancing programs. They have a consumer protection role related to their licensure and regulation of post-secondary institutions in Minnesota. They collect information and data and perform research, so they're a great resource for members. If you have questions, we can ask the Office of Higher Education questions on your behalf if that's something that we need to do. They provide consumer-facing navigational resource and services, so that means sort of for students and future college students and their families, providing information to them. They administer the state's 529 college savings plan, and they negotiate interstate tuition reciprocity agreements with some of our neighbor states. The University of Minnesota, of course, has its role of educating students, and it has a special function of conducting research as a research institution. And Min-State also, educating students, and they have a special function regarding training the workforce and workforce development. So I'll touch on each of these. So first, the Office of Higher Education. The Office of Higher Education is an executive department. It's a creature of statute. The commissioner, Dennis Olson, is appointed by the governor with the advice and consent of the Senate. It most currently has 84 full-time employees. It has a student advisory council that provides input and feedback, and this includes student representatives from different kinds of post-secondary institutions in Minnesota. OHE organizes itself into 8 main program areas: student financial aid services, grants and loan repayment programs, self-loans and self-refinancing, research policy and analysis, the 529 plan administration, post-secondary access and outreach, agency administration, and then institutional licensing and registration. So that's a handy way to think about what the Office of Higher Education does and what its main missions are. One thing I wanted to highlight, and this is a great way for committee members to sort of frame the work of the committee, it's a way that the Office of Higher Education frames a lot of its work, is the state attainment goal, the 2025 attainment goal. This was enacted in 2015, and it sets a goal for the state of Minnesota that the number of Minnesota residents aged 25 to 44 who hold a post-secondary or industry-recognized credential should be at least 75% by 2025. This was updated in 2023 to also recognize industry credentials and certifications. So that changed the numbers a little bit. But it's important for this committee to sort of be aware of this because because the goal is for 2025. So it's likely to need some updating pretty soon. Here's the most recent data regarding the attainment goal. It's broken down by race and ethnic group, which the statute specifies should be done for reporting reasons. The all category there is all Minnesotans, so that's the fundamental goal, is to get that number to 70%. It's at 63.3% estimate for 2024 right now. And as you can see, there are some pretty wide disparities by racial and ethnic group. So moving on from the attainment goal, I want to especially talk about some of the Office of Higher Education's financial aid programs. There are a number of them, 10 are listed here. This list only includes ongoing programs. There are also some temporary programs the legislature has created. There's currently a paramedic program, but those are not in statute. They don't have an ongoing base appropriation. These are the 10 that you will see into the future, in the past, and currently. And the main two that I want to talk about for the committee a little bit today are the state grant program, which is the largest program, and the North Star Promise program, which is the newest program and which is also quite large. Some basics about the state grant program. This is the state's largest financial aid program. It was established in 1969. It's a need-based program, and it uses FAFSA data that the students report to the federal government for student aid. So that's how it evaluates financial need. It's also based fundamentally on what's called the design for shared responsibility. And this is the idea that students and their families and taxpayers will all share in the burden or have responsibility for paying for a student's post-secondary education. The eligibility criteria for the state grant program, you have to be a Minnesota resident. It's for undergraduate students. You can be enrolled full-time or part-time, but your award will be prorated if you're enrolled less than full-time. You can get it for up to 8 semesters of full-time enrollment or the equivalent, and you have to attend an eligible institution. And eligible institutions for purposes of the state grant program include all the public post-secondary institutions, so everything there in the University of Minnesota and the Min-State system, and also any private institutions that are licensed or registered with OHE and that participate in federal student aid, like the Pell Grant program.
Mr. Hopkins, I have a quick question. So you have at the very top, Minnesota resident. And what is the definition of that? What's the residency requirements for this? Because I ask only because there's different requirements across statute, and so I'm just curious what this one is.
Madam Chair and members, so for residency for the state grant program, there are a number of criteria that a student could fulfill in order to be designated as a Minnesota resident. I don't have them all in front of me. There's 10 of them. And I could get that information to you in more complete form.
Thank you, Mr. Hopkins. It's very complicated, and I know that there are different definitions throughout statute. Same thing for what constitutes a family is a different definition across all of statute. So I apologize for putting you on the spot. I was hoping it would be a fairly simple and straightforward answer, but just by knowing what you just said, again, it's very, very complicated, and I might say a little overly complicated. So we will revisit that, but thank you for saying that, and please continue.
Sure. Here are some basic figures from fiscal year 2023 for the state grant program. It served a total of 67,854 students and distributed $215 million in total awards. That makes the average state grant award $3,168. But because of the way the formula works for awarding state grants, there are larger average awards for lower income students. And then 54% of recipients had family incomes under $40,000 a year.
Too many things happening was, one side, we have a question from Representative Scott, and
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Hopkins, it says that these grants went to 67,854 students. How many students are enrolled in Minnesota state colleges and University of Minnesota? If you know, like a ballpark annual figure. If not, that's fine too. It's kind of,
I don't know.
Representative Scott, I'm sorry, one second, Mr. Hopkins. I know that we have somebody from, you asked about the Mid-State system specifically?
well, Mid-State and, I mean, how many students do we have in higher education right now?
In totality?
Yeah.
Okay. I know we have somebody from both the University of Minnesota system that's here and from the Mid-State system, if they have that information. I'll look, yes. Okay, so we have somebody from University of Minnesota, if she would like to come up and give the totality, because actually they've grown, so they're probably very excited about that number. So we'll start with. Ms. Melissa Lopez-Franzen,
Thank you, Madam.
and state your name for the record.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Melissa Lopez-Franzen with the University of Minnesota Government Relations Team. And we're excited to announce we have 70,000 students as of this last number that we've had. So it's a historic high for the university, and that is what we have right now enrolled.
Thank you. That's amazing, because I have the number of around 60,000, so that's a lot of students. And so we will see if also we've got Mid-State still in the room. We do. So we have a gentleman from Mid-State. Mr. Oman is going to come up and share their good news as well. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Oman. Do you happen to have that number on the top of your head?
Chair Rarick and members, we'll get back to the committee with the exact numbers, but overall, our FTE is around 160,000 students, and our total Minnesotans served is in the neighborhood of 240,000. That includes everything from certificates to folks that are taking customized training, but I'll get the exact number. Our enrollments, for the most part across the system, is up. The two-year enrollments are higher than the four-year enrollments, and I think it's all but a couple of our campuses have experienced enrollment increases over the past year, which is a difference than we've experienced over the past decade. But we will get the exact numbers to the committee members.
Thank you, Mr. Oman. That is really good news, and I heard as much as 7 to 8% depending on where we're at, and so we've got quite a bit of increase in enrollment. So if you add those numbers together, which I didn't do off the top of my head, but you've got them there. Do you have any other further questions?
No, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the testifier.
Yeah, it is good. I just have to say, I was going to acknowledge that we had representatives from both Mid-State and from University of Minnesota in the room, and I know we had someone from the Council of Nonprofits here as well. She is here still. And so I would like to note for the record that they are all here and ready to work with us. Unfortunately, he is not. So, and Chris, Representative Robbins, you have a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. I just did have a question. This average award of $3,168, is that the average accounting for the grant reductions that had to happen this year? Or is that pre the reductions?
Mr. Hopkins.
Madam Chair, Representative Robbins, these are the fiscal year 2023 numbers, so these weren't subject to that reduction. I don't know if a later slide touches on this, but OHE has the authority to reduce or increase state grant awards in order to accommodate an excess appropriation or an insufficient appropriation for that program. So if there's more money, everyone's state grant awards can go up, and if there's not enough money, state grant awards can be reduced. Typically, that only happens in the second year of the biennium because they can transfer money between the 2 years. So,
Representative Robbins.
Thank you. So could you just remind us, what was the amount that state grants were reduced by total, or the fund was reduced by this year in the second year of the biennium?
Mr. Hopkins.
But this was the first year and they had a reduction.
They'll answer, but they did see a reduction in the year we are in right now.
Thank you.
Mr. Hopkins or Mr. Savory?
Madam Chair, Representative Robbins, I don't have that figure with me, but I can follow up with you afterwards.
Any other questions? Okay, seeing none, Mr. Hopkins, please continue.
Madam Chair and members, also to go back to Representative Scott's question about the 667,000 students, the question would kind of be, what's the right denominator to be using here? So we give awards to this many students total, but how many students could potentially receive an award? And then you'd have to look at, they'd all have to be Minnesota residents. They'd only have to be undergraduate students. You'd be looking at enrollments at any institution where a student could receive a state grant award. So not just the publics, but tribal colleges and private colleges that are eligible institutions. So to sort of understand 67,000 students received awards out of how many potentially eligible students, we'd have to get the right denominator to really answer that question in a way that provides the right kind of information. And I can work on that for you. This is a chart showing the average combined federal Pell Grant and Minnesota State Grant awards by a student's family adjusted gross income category. So you can see that larger awards go to students that have lower family adjusted gross incomes, and awards get smaller as the adjusted gross income of the family increases. This is a slide, it's probably the most complicated slide in the whole presentation. But it's important for the committee to be aware that the state grant program does have an award formula. This formula has several components, and one way that the legislature can change the state grant program is by adjusting any of these levers. A student's grant amount typically equals the cost of attendance minus the assigned student responsibility and minus the assigned family responsibility minus the Pell Grant award that the student is eligible for. So cost of attendance for the purposes of the state grant program are the tuition and fees charged by the institution plus the living and miscellaneous expenses designated. The legislature can change the amount of living and miscellaneous expenses factored in by law. There's also a default that is typically used, which is 115% of the federal poverty guidelines for a one-person household in Minnesota for 9 months. The tuition and fees, because keep in mind that the state grant program can also go to students who attend private post-secondary institutions or other kinds of institutions that might have higher tuitions. The tuition and fees used for the cost of calculating the cost of attendance is capped at the highest equivalent public institution, depending on if it's a 2-year or 4-year institution. So there's a cap for basically it's the University of Minnesota Twin Cities tuition rate for 4-year institutions. And it's also prorated for less than full-time enrollment. The assigned student responsibility is 50% of that cost of attendance. So the idea that a student is responsible for 50% of that amount, that gets back to that design for shared responsibility that I mentioned earlier, the concept that the taxpayers, the students, and the students' families should share in the burden of paying for post-secondary institution education. And then the assigned family responsibility, which is the FAFSA-determined family contribution. Currently, this is referred to as the student aid index, multiplied by these percentages depending on the student's family situation. And a new thing related to the way the federal government operates FAFSA and the new student aid index is that the FAFSA-determined family contribution, the student aid index, now can be a negative number. That didn't used to be true. So if it's a negative number, then the family contribution is just whatever that student aid index, whatever that negative number is. We don't multiply it by anything. And the Pell Grant is, of course, the amount of a federal Pell Grant for which the student is eligible. And the slide also mentions that OHE has that ability to reduce or increase awards to accommodate insufficient or surplus appropriations. So these are all, each of these factors, the AFR, the ASR, the LME, these are all factors that the legislature can change. And in doing so, the legislature will change how much the state grant program costs. I sort of buried the lead here, but one reason why it was important, I think, to get in a little more detail about the state grant program is that the most recent cost projections for the coming biennium show a deficit for the program that's significant. So we will likely need to make not just changes to the appropriation for the program, but changes to that formula in order to deal with this deficit. The deficit's attributable largely to enrollment increases, especially from high-need students who receive larger awards. And also some of the FAFSA changes, like this negative SAI that I mentioned, were much more impactful and much more expensive than OHE had originally anticipated.
Representative Scott, you had a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Hopkins, to the previous slide, under assigned family responsibility, I've always been curious why, the bullet point I'm addressing is the 35% if student is independent without children. So I've never understood why, like, my daughter was living completely independently her last 2 years of college. I still had to fill out the FAFSA and she got a big fat zero. So she is paying everything, all of her own expenses, all of that. Is there something that goes into the definition of a student that's independent that would have figured into that equation? If you know, I know this is FAFSA, but.
Mr. Hopkins.
Madam Chair, Representative Scott, I believe it has to do with just their tax reporting, whether or not they're listed as a dependent on their parents' tax return. But I'm not positive.
That's weird because we weren't claiming her. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Hopkins. All right, any other questions? No? Okay, Mr. Hopkins.
Madam Chair and members, so moving on to talk a little bit about the North Star program, which is sort of the second major financial aid program that OHE administers. So this program was created in 2023, and the first scholarships were awarded in the current 2024 to 2025 academic year. Unlike the state grant program, North Star Promise scholarships are only available to students that are attending public post-secondary institutions or tribal colleges, not private colleges in Minnesota. There is an $80,000 family AGI income cap for this program. So if your family AGI is under 80,000, you are eligible. If it is over 80,000, you are not eligible. This is a last dollar scholarship, so there's no set amount in law for it. It is intended to cover the remaining tuition and fees that the student has to pay at their institution after factoring in all other gift aid, so grants, scholarships, et cetera. Loans are not considered gift aid because you have to pay them back, and that's no kind of a gift. So note that this is just tuition and fees, not the full cost of attendance. And then there's the additional North Star Promise Plus scholarships that I talked about earlier that are up to 50% of a student's federal Pell Grant amount. These are paid for with one-time money that's in a special revenue fund. It's not part of the ongoing appropriation for the program. These are only available for academic years, for the 3 first academic years the program's in existence.
I think we have a question from Representative Robbins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So when it says on the bottom of the slide that up to 50% of the federal Pell amount, who determines how much they get?
Mr. Hopkins.
Madam Chair, Representative Robbins, the commissioner has the authority to adjust the amounts of a North Star Promise Plus scholarship depending on the demand, the eligibility, and the amounts available, and also for that year and projecting forward for the 3 years that these are supposed to be made available. So there's no set amount for it. It's left to the commissioner's discretion to find the right number.
Representative Robbins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And do you know what the average has been for this current year that we're in, or is it too early to get that data?
Mr. Hopkins.
Madam Chair, Representative Robbins, so yeah, this was the first year that these were awarded, and I don't have the preliminary information about what the average award amount would have been for this first academic year.
Representative Robbins, I'm hoping that OHE will be able to come at some point, and they could probably answer these questions for you. I was really disappointed that they couldn't be here today or indefinitely, and depending on what they decide with the governor. So I would love to get those questions answered as well. Thank you. Mr. Hopkins.
Madam Chair and members, moving on from the main financial assistance programs, I wanted to talk a little bit about OHE's role administering state supplemental loan programs. So there are 2 main programs to talk about here, the self-loan program. The legislature historically hasn't been too involved with these. They're self-sustaining programs. They don't get any sort of state appropriation. These are low-interest loans for post-secondary students. This shows that currently there's over 27,000 borrowers owing $415 million. In fiscal year 2023, the office issued $57.3 million in loans to 5,728 students. There's also a self-refi program which allows students to refinance existing educational loans at a lower interest rate. Like the self-loan program, this program's self-sustaining. It doesn't receive any legislative appropriation. It is currently paused for new applications because there's a change in the loan servicer, but it's expected to be back up and running in late 2025. Moving on to the next main programmatic area for the Office of Higher Education, grant and loan repayment programs. There are a number of these that are funded through legislative appropriations. I've sort of broken them up here into 3 main categories. Competitive grants, these are grants that are administered by the Office of Higher Education, so people apply to the Office of Higher Education for these grants. Some of them are for post-secondary institutions, such as the emergency assistance grants, hunger-free campus grants, concurrent enrollment programs, et cetera. And some of them, 2 of them, are for research, biomedical research. That includes the spinal cord and traumatic brain injury grant program and the Tomasoni ALS research grant program. The next big category are pass-through grants. So these are grants that are made to the Office of Higher Education, but are designated to then flow through to an outside agency. It might be a state entity, it might be a nonprofit, it might be a local government. But some examples of pass-through grants are grants to tribal colleges, to library systems, to the Inclusive Higher Education Technical Assistance Center, which is a creature of statute that the legislature created. It's housed at the University of Minnesota. The foster care grant that flows through to a nonprofit, and medical fellowships. So these might pay for various fellowships at hospitals, so they would flow through the Office of Higher Education to hospitals or clinics or medical systems. And the third category within this program are student loan repayment programs. So these are grant programs for students who have already completed their degree, but might be dealing with a lot of student debt. There are currently programs for agricultural educators, aviation degrees, like aviation technicians and pilots, public service attorneys, teachers, and rural veterinarians. So these are areas where the legislature in the past has said, we think that we need more of these kinds of people in the state of Minnesota doing this work, and we want to attract them to Minnesota, we want them to stay in Minnesota, so we are going to help them with their student debt that they have because they completed the academic program to get this kind of job that we want them to be doing here.
Representative Robbins, you had a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When we look at the grants for spinal cord injury and traumatic brain and ALS, so this is separate from the special research grants with the Mayo Foundation and the U. So I'm just interested, like, how did OHE decide to get into this research grant situation?
Thank you, Representative Robbins. I think that if OHE was here, they would say this was a gift from the legislature, but I will let Mr. Hopkins explain what that means. Thank you.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Representative Robbins, I think that's right. These aren't programs that would traditionally be higher education related programs, but they're programs that OHE has and that they administer. They're grants for medical research. OHE typically partners with outside experts that have more expertise in this kind of a subject area in order to evaluate the proposals that they receive as part of these competitive grants. They go typically to institutions in Minnesota doing this kind of research, largely which are at either the Mayo Clinic or the University of Minnesota hospitals, because those are our main biomedical research facilities in Minnesota.
Thank you. Mr. Hopkins, continue.
All right, my last slide for the Office of Higher Education deals with their responsibility, their mission of consumer protection, licensing, and which they fulfill primarily by licensing and regulating institutions. They set minimum requirements for the institutions. They will investigate student complaints about institutions, assess the institution's financial viability. In the past, the state has had issues with institutions closing abruptly, and students are that puts students in a really difficult position. So the Office of Higher Education tries to get in front of that by monitoring the financial viability of institutions and also helping when a school does need to close to do that in an orderly way that leaves the students in the best position possible. There are two main laws that the legislature has authority over dealing with the licensure and regulation of post-secondary institutions. There is the Private Career School Act, which regulates institutions that offer programs at less than an associate degree level, so like a lot of workforce certification type programs, cosmetology, for instance, massage schools, things like that. And then the Private and Out-of-State Public Post-Secondary Education Act, which deals with degree granting programs, public or private, for-profit or nonprofit, anything at an associate's degree level or above. So, Madam Chair, unless there are any more questions about the Office of Higher Education, I'll move on to my slides about the University of Minnesota.
I'm not seeing any. You can continue.
Okay, this is the first of the two public post-secondary systems that I wanted to discuss as part of this presentation. The University of Minnesota consists of 5 campuses in the Twin Cities campus, Duluth, Morris, Rochester, and Crookston. Here's some basic information about each of those campuses and kind of what sets them apart and their 23-24 tuition levels. This is undergraduate, full-time, resident tuition. It does not include fees. So in addition to the primary mission of educating students, the University of Minnesota has a unique mission in that it is our flagship research institution here in the state. So here are some just basic facts about the university's role as a research institution. They received $1.06 billion in research awards in fiscal year '24. You can see the majority of that were federal dollars, but some of it was state support as well. Some of those would include the direct appropriations that Mr. Savory mentioned for health sciences and medical research, other kinds of research, and some of it could include money from the competitive grant programs, the traumatic brain injury grants or the ALS grants, if the University of Minnesota received any of those. Technology commercialization. So in addition to doing the research that's done at the University of Minnesota, often results in a lot of economic benefit to the state and to the country as a whole. And this is done largely through technology commercialization. So transferring research to licensee companies. And some facts and figures: in 2024, the University of Minnesota launched 25 new startup companies, 22 of which were based in Minnesota. It had 375 new invention disclosures, which are kind of the sort of precursor to a new patent filing, 126 first patent filings, 226 licensing deals in 2024, and in 2024, licensing revenue for technology commercialization brought in $20 million to the institution. Another unique feature of the University of Minnesota is its extension service. There are University of Minnesota extension offices in every county of the state, with also a number of regional offices. The extension service runs 4-H programs for youth. It helps with food and agriculture, lawn and garden, public health, natural resources, and community development. And 65% of its staff is in Greater Minnesota. One unique feature of the University of Minnesota that you will hear about is its constitutional autonomy. I'm going to talk about that in these next two slides. And this first slide sort of lays the groundwork and background for this idea of constitutional autonomy. The University of Minnesota is older than the state of Minnesota. It was founded in 1851, and its charter was created by our territorial legislature. And you will see there are two sections of the territorial legislature's law, which are still in the University of Minnesota's charter, and they give the regents power to enact laws for the government of the university, and it says the government of the university shall be vested in a board of 12 regents. And then in 1858, when Minnesota became a state, they essentially incorporated the charter into the Constitution in this highlighted line on the slide, which says that all the rights, immunities, franchises, and endowments heretofore granted or conferred upon the University of Minnesota are perpetuated unto the university. So this is the idea that authority of the regents to govern the university is incorporated into the Constitution and perpetuated as part of the Minnesota Constitution. So here are the three main features of constitutional autonomy that it's important for members of this committee to keep in mind. Constitutional autonomy is a court-created doctrine, but it's well established in Minnesota. The first fundamental rule is that the internal management of the university and governance of the university is committed to the regents, not to the legislature. So unlike, say, the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities system, they are not simply a state agency like other state agencies. There are things that the legislature cannot tell them what to do, because they have autonomy to govern the regents have the autonomy to govern the university. However, the legislature still has the power of the purse, and the court cases that have developed this idea of constitutional autonomy have held that the legislature can place conditions on university appropriations. So the legislature can say, we will give you this money, but you must do X, and that's valid so long as the conditions promote the general welfare and they make limited intrusions on the regent's powers to govern the university. So we can condition appropriations, but we can't say, we will give you this money to do X, but we can't just say to the regents, you must do X. That's the difference between those two. A condition on an appropriation versus just a directive from the legislature. Also, the university is a state system. It is part of the state of Minnesota, and it is subject to the legislature's general lawmaking power. So general rules that affect the entirety of the state, like the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act, also apply to the university. They're not exempt from these sorts of general laws that apply to the state as a whole. Moving on from constitutional autonomy, just a bit about the governance of the university. So it's governed by a board of regents, and The composition of the Board of Regents is determined by the university's charter, which is of course incorporated into our state constitution, and by statute. There are 12 regents total. They're elected by a joint convention of the legislature. The House and Senate come together to elect these regents. They're elected to 6-year terms with no term limits. Typically, they're staggered into 3 classes, so 4 regents are typically up for election every biennium. That is the case this year. Four seats will be up for election this year. If there are any irregular vacancies due to resignations or deaths, those are filled by the governor until the next legislative session. And by statute, so this is typically considered to be non-binding on the legislature for purposes of region election, but at least one member from each congressional seat for the state of Minnesota on the board of 12 regents. So you have 8 designated seats for each of the 8 congressional districts and 4 at-large seats. And by statute, one of those at-large seats must be filled by a current university student. And that's the case right now. That's how we do it. The region election process. So this is certainly relevant for this committee this year because you will be participating in the election of 4 regents this year. The first step in the process begins with a Regent Candidate Advisory Council. They recruit and screen candidates for regents, and they make recommendations to the Joint Legislative Committee. They have done that this year, so they've made their recommendations. They get a number of people who apply. They have done interviews, and they have determined that the number of people that they recommend to the legislature, they say, we think that any of these people would be good candidates for a regent. And then you move on to the Joint Legislative Committee. This is composed of the House and the Senate Higher Education Committees together. It's co-chaired by the 2 chairs of the committees. They will consider the RCAC recommendations and also accept new candidate nominations who may not have been recommended by RCAC, who may not have even applied to RCAC. A new candidate can come in at any stage of this process. And the Joint Legislative Committee will make recommendations to the joint convention that elects the regents. This happens by February 28th typically, but it can vary. The goal of the Joint Legislative Committee is to nominate 1 person for each vacancy, although that doesn't always happen, and sometimes they nominate 2 people, and there's a more competitive election at the joint convention. The final stage is the Joint Legislative Convention, which receives joint committee recommendations and also can accept new candidate nominations who may not have been recommended by the joint committee, and this will elect the regents. It usually happens in early March. A little more information about the Joint Legislative Committee. I think I already covered all of this. Yes, I basically did. These are the 4 regent seats that are up for election this year. 2 at-large seats, 1 at-large student seat, and then the 5th congressional district seat. That's my last slide, Madam Chair, about the University of Minnesota. If anyone has any questions, I can pause or move on to Minnesota State.
Representative Novotny.
So there's been reports of a group received a grant from the University of Minnesota. The group charitably described as an extremist or left-wing group. Several of us that are involved in community or public safety, it's a group called Communities Against Police Brutality. They're reporting that they received a grant from the University of Minnesota for community outreach last month. Doing everything I can to find how much they got and what was the basis for that award. Where do I find that and how do I get it?
Mr. Hopkins, if you can't answer, we do have several members from the lobby team from the U of M.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Representative Novotny, I'd recommend reaching out to the University of Minnesota's government relations folks for that information.
Thank you.
Anything further, Representative Novotny? Anybody? Okay, and so we can, Representative Novotny, they are here, so after the committee, you can certainly, they're waving at you. So they will get in touch with you. Any other questions from the committee? Okay, Thank you, Mr. Hopkins.
Okay, Madam Chair and members, the third and final thing that I wanted to discuss as part of this presentation is the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities System, the second of the one of the two public post-secondary systems in Minnesota. There are 7 state universities in this system: Bemidji State University, Metro State, Moorhead, Mankato, Southwest, St. Cloud, and Winona. This slide sort of lists the undergraduate student count for each of those institutions and has the average annual in-state full-time tuition and fees for the 24-25 academic year for the average across all those institutions. The tuition and fees do vary somewhat institution to institution. So 7 state universities and 26 state colleges, which are listed here. Some of the state colleges have multiple campuses. And this also lists the 24-25 average annual full-time tuition and fees for the institutions, which is $6,189. A little bit of history. So the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities system was created through a 1991 merger of the state universities, the community colleges, and the technical colleges, which previously used to be separate from each other and separately governed. So by merging them together, the legislature basically had several goals, such as removing duplicative academic programming, eliminating duplicative administrative and student service positions, centralizing governance for greater efficiency, and allowing easier credit transfers among institutions. This also makes things easier because it centralizes funding. The legislature doesn't have to fund each institution separately or each kind of institution separately. The main operations and maintenance appropriation that Mr. Savory discussed goes to the system as a whole, and then the system has a formula by which they distribute it to all the various member institutions. The governance of Minnesota State is vested in a board of trustees. There are 15 members serving staggered 6-year terms. Unlike the regents of the university, these are appointed by the governor with the advice of consent of the Senate, not elected by the legislature. Each of the 8 congressional districts are represented. There are 3 student members serving 2-year terms and 1 labor member. There are recommendations made to the governor for those student members and labor members, but those are non-binding on the governor. And I sort of discussed the special research role that the University of Minnesota had, so I definitely want to talk about the special role that the Min-State system has with regard to workforce development. 2 main categories to touch on for purposes of introduction for this committee. There's a workforce development scholarship that the legislature established that's administered by Minnesota State directly. These are scholarships of $2,500 per year, and they go to students in any of these applicable fields. So these are meant to help develop the state's workforce in these high-demand areas. And the very last one there, this list has grown over the years too. The legislature has been pretty active in the scholarship program to increase the fields that are eligible for these scholarships, including adding any regionally in-demand field for a given institution. So there might be a specific institution, they have a high need in that region for a certain kind of job that's not listed here, that can still be eligible for these scholarships if it's a regionally in-demand field. The second main category, customized training. Min-State provides customized training to employers. They have over 7,000 employer partnerships across Minnesota and offer over 9,950 customized and specialized training, occupational and professional classes via these employer partnerships. So that's a unique role that Min-State has in the workforce development for the state. Madam Chair, that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Members, any final questions on this very long, thorough, and wonderful presentation? That was amazing. I think this is the deepest that we've gone on an overview in my 13 years now, so I appreciate that in-depth overview, and especially since we couldn't have OHI here, this is fantastic, and I really do appreciate having the other systems in the room, though, all 3. Well, we've got the private colleges represented as well, so it does mean a lot to us that you're here and ready to work. Do you have more to present, either Mr. Savory or Mr. Hopkins?
No.
Okay, so without, unless there's no other further questions, no? Okay, we'll be meeting next Tuesday. Remember, Monday is a holiday. We don't normally meet on Monday anyway, but Monday is a holiday, and we'll be meeting next Tuesday. We'll see you there, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here, for those that were here, and we are adjourned.